Everyone, I want to do something a little bit different today. I wanted to talk about the concept of life as a resource, which is a saying you probably heard if you played a little bit of Magic, and it's something I think is, true to an extent, but often misapplied. So I wanted to sort of talk about what it means and where I think people are sort of maybe using it in the wrong way. So when we just start playing Magic, we don't always have a good sense of who's winning the game, and life total often becomes a proxy for who's winning. This is a game where we don't have a score, um, so we use life total as sort of a stand-in for that a lot of the time. And if you look at sort of this situation, right, a player with 18 life and a Ragavan in play is, I think, to most experienced players, obviously ahead in the game versus a player with just a tapped land and 21 life. But there's no way to really know that. There's no really objective measure of these type of things that we have. So I think a lot of players, when they start out, tend to just say whoever has more life total is winning because they view reducing your opponent's life total as steps towards getting it to zero, which is the goal of the game. And what most interests me in this topic was over the years there have been times where I felt that I evaluated cards differently than other people. And I think for a long time I was maybe wrong about those things. And then at some point, I think because of the changes in design, the pendulum has sort of swung to where people are evaluating some of these cards differently. And I feel like I'm able to be more in line with the consensus on these. So Vampire Spawn is a card from AFR, which is Adventures in the Forgotten Realm. It's like the D&D set. And it's a 2/3 for 3, and each opponent loses 2 life, and you gain 2 life. It's a very unassuming looking card. An important context is that black-red was by far the best deck for a lot of this format. But this card had really good stats, and I think it surprised a lot of people because being a 2/3 for 3 is not that impressive. But the 2-point life loss and life gain actually turned out to be pretty significant in a way that a lot of people didn't expect. And I think for a lot of people, this was sort of a turning point towards valuing life totals differently. And a couple of these other cards I just wanted to briefly touch on is Drowsing Pteranodon is sort of an example of a type of card they've been putting in a lot of sets, which is a 3/3 with Defender that can attack under certain circumstances. And one thing about these cards is they're pretty inflexible a lot of the time, unless you can make them attack reliably. But they are incredibly good on defense. You can see that these are obviously in different formats, but this is a 3/3 for 2, and this can block the Vampire Spawn that's a 2/3 for 3. So it's even up on mana, so it's able to play defense even up on mana, which is very interesting in terms of working out a defensive curve. And obviously, it doesn't contribute to your attack. And, life totals matter in both directions. But this is a type of card, and I think Drowsing Pteranodon is one of the better versions of this card, but it's a type of card you keep seeing, and oftentimes they're bad, but there are situations where I think they're sort of being underrated because of the inflexibility. And then obviously you have something like Sun-Tailed Hawk, and there's a million of these type of cards. Basically any evasive 1/1, right? And 1-drops have gotten way, way better. So this is something we've seen. And I think, if you ever played against something like a Sun-Tailed Hawk, and you don't have a ton of removal in your deck, and you don't have any reach creatures available, Sun-Tailed Hawk reads like Lava Axe a lot of the time. It will just deal 5 or 6 or even more damage to your opponent or to you over the course of the game. And that seems incredibly strong when it works out like that. When you play it on turn 1, they have nothing. So for a long time, I was really, I think, maybe overvaluing these cards. But I think at some point people started to sort of undervalue them as the landscape of Magic design has shifted to a more, a game that starts on turn 1 more than it starts on turn 2 or 3. I mean, you had formats in the past where if you skipped your first 2 turns and then played a 2/2 on turn 3, like, you were still in the game. That's not often the case anymore. And, Duskmourn, when I was going through my lessons from that set, which is now the current set, one of the things I realized or I felt was that red in this particular set has a ton of reach. So when you talk about life as a resource, one of the things you'll hear is that, the first 19 points don't matter. It's really only the last point. But if you are playing in sets with reach or sets with creatures that are hard to block, whatever that sort of means, you can't count on stabilizing at 1 life anymore. You're really talking about stabilizing before that, at 5 or 6, and even then you could still be in danger. So the idea that you can sort of just spend or not worry about, I guess, your first 19 points, I think has been less true recently, and I think it's something that we need to sort of shift our perceptions of. So what does it mean when people say life is a resource? And a lot of times it means basically, they'll say it sort of, if they're being a little bit casual about it, they'll say the first 19 life points don't matter. It's only the last point that matters. You can understand why they're saying this, because if you're reduced to 1 life, you are still in the game. If you win the game when you're on 1 life, you win just as much if you're on 20 life or 1,000,000 life. That's absolutely true. However, there are obviously differences in the way you can play if you're on 1 life and 20 life, and that's something we're going to sort of get into. Secondly, use life, to trade for card advantage, which is usually mattering more. There used to be a format at, I think, the Invitational, which I believe no longer exists, and they would have people, you could bid for the decks you wanted to play, and you would first bid on starting card hand size, and then the tiebreaker was life total. Cards were valued so much higher than life, and, I think for good reason. But I think, there's obviously a point where life would matter more than cards. It's not worth, a single card isn't worth an infinite amount of life. So we're always sort of trying to, depending on the format, depending on the situation, figure out where that, number that we would trade them at is. And, obviously trading life for cards or tempo or board control, these are all things you're going to have to do. Sometimes you need to choose not to use removal on a creature that's attacking you so you can develop your board, and then you can use that removal later, and you'll have traded a few life points in order to develop your board more efficiently because, say, the removal didn't allow you to spend all your mana that turn or something like that. So then just some examples of cards. When Magic was first made, probably about 30 years ago now, I believe these were all in alpha or beta, whatever the sets were then. Ancestral Recall, Healing Slough, and Lightning Bolt were all sort of part of a cycle, sort of a 1 mana, the effect has 3 on them. And Ancestral Recall is obviously the best one. 1 mana, draw 3 cards is, much better than, 1 mana, deal 3 to any target. Because 3 cards it's sort of worth more damage. You can't just use the number 3 and assume everything's equivalent. And Lightning Bolt is much better than Healing Salve most of the time, which gains 3 life or prevents 3 damage. Now, you'll note that Healing Salve can basically just counter a Lightning Bolt straight up, but those cards aren't really of equivalent power level. And I think that's sort of something that, most people recognize, but it's not clear why exactly that's the case. And, burn decks are a thing in some formats, and the goal of those decks is basically to play 7 lightning bolts targeting your opponent over the course of, 3 or 4 turns usually, and reduce them to 0. And obviously if you played 7 healing salves, that's really maybe pretty good against a burn deck, but pretty bad against any other deck because you now have no cards in your hand and your opponent has been, developing their board. So all this sort of leads me to the idea that the thing about resources, represented here by Drum of Oil or Catan cards and this little magic die, life total, is that we want more of them, right? When we talk about life as a resource, that doesn't mean it has no value. That actually means it has a lot of value in Magic, and that using our life total wisely in making those trades for board control and tempo and card advantage is actually a big part of the skill of Magic. It doesn't mean that we can just use, our life total can be thrown away and that's, effective play or that's a smart move. I think most people understand that, but they don't often play like that. So, sort of one of the, the most obvious things and maybe sort of the most archetypical new player mistake is your opponent attacks, you're at 20 life, they're at 20 life. They attack you with a 3/3, you have a 2/2. I think any experienced player is saying, I don't want to make this block, right? I don't want to use my 2/2 to basically just say gain 3 life. because that's, when I'm at 20 life, that's not really an effective use of the resource that is that card. And I think when we think back to, cards like Rejuvenating Stream, which we saw, or even Healing Self, one of the reasons that life gain cards aren't that good in general isn't that life gain isn't good, it's that life gain cards aren't actually that good at preserving our life totals. A 2/2 that blocks this 3/3 also gains us 3 life, but also can do a bunch of other things. And a 2/2 that blocks a 2/2 and trades with it will, over the course of the game, gain us so much more life than a similarly costed card that just says gain some amount of life on it. So when we talk about life gain cards generally not being good, and that, when I say life gain cards, I mean cards that literally just say gain some amount of life and have no other effects, they're just not very good at the only job they're doing, which is why they're often considered very weak. So here is sort of the reason why life total matters, right? If in the same scenario we only have 3 life, we are now forced to block. So as much as those first 17 points didn't matter, they actually are making us make a play that we just thought of as suboptimal a moment ago. We don't want to make this play, but we're forced to because our life total is so low. So this is the concern about being cavalier with your life total early on, is that eventually you'll be forced to make inefficient plays and sort of trade back those cards and board control for life at a worse rate. Now, the dream of letting this hill giant through when we have a grizzly bear is that eventually we might have 2 grizzly bears. And now we can instead block. Obviously, combat tricks, whatever, we'll get into that. But this is the scenario we want, is we can use these resources in a better spot. If that grizzly bear was always only going to gain us 3 life, we could do it, when we're at 20 life, we could do it later, we could do all kinds of things with it. But the grizzly bear actually has other abilities, or it can be used in other ways, I guess. It's still just a 2/2 for 2, but it can be used in conjunction with other grizzly bears to now trade with the hill giant. So if we have a life total buffer, we can not make the block in the first scenario where we only have 1 grizzly bear, and now make it in this scenario. And this is obviously better. Now, imagine instead we have 2 grizzly bears, and they have a hill giant untapped, and we're thinking about, should we attack? I would say, if we're both at 20 life, usually the answer is going to be no. We don't want to trade that grizzly bear for 2 damage to them, much in the same way we didn't want to trade it in, for 3 damage to us, right? If they were at a different life total, this may be different. But, using this, obviously grizzly bears, the point of most creatures is that they can change life totals at some point, and the way we want to use them is to do it efficiently. Imagine instead we have 4 grizzly bears, right? Do we attack with 4 grizzly bears into a hill giant? I mean, oftentimes I think the answer is yes, right? And obviously there's some number of grizzly bears. If we imagine 11 grizzly bears attacking a person with 20 life and 1 hill giant, that's lethal. So we'd probably do that. If we have 4, do we still do it? The answer is maybe, right? In 5 and 6 and 7, they all have sort of different answers. So if we say we don't want to do it on 2, but we maybe do want to do it on 4, then the question becomes, do we do it with 3, right? And this depends on your deck. It depends on how your deck is going to play, how much your opponent's life total is going to matter over the course of the game, and how you build. But the point is that this is all a sliding scale. There's a point where these sacrificing this grizzly bear to do damage to your opponent makes sense, and there's a point where it doesn't. And we don't have a hard and fast rule for that. So one of the harder things in Magic, and I think one of the things people struggle with the most when we think about life being a resource, is this scenario, right? Instead of them attacking us with a 3/3 and us having a 2/2, they are attacking us with a 2/2 and we have a 3/3. And obviously, if there's no cards in hand, no mana untapped, we block this, right? The problem is, what if they do have cards untapped, or cards in hand and mana untapped? How does that change this equation? And of course, what we're afraid of is a combat trick, right? We're afraid of getting blown out, allowing them to trade up in mana. So we don't want to make this block sometimes because we think it's going to let them trade a lesser resource of a 1 mana combat trick for a 4 mana Hill Giant here. So this is what we're trying to avoid, and this is why people shy away from blocking in the scenario. Knowing this, though, this allows us to, get into sort of the leveling of our opponent thinks if they attack with mana untapped, we might be afraid to block, and because we know that our opponent knows that about us, because, if missing out on the 2 point of damage, we have to evaluate how much that would matter. And then we have some other scenarios, right? Let's say instead of a 2/2 versus 3/3, we have a 3/1 versus a 1/3 that has a powerful ability, right? Paranormal Analyst is a 1/3 for 2. Whenever you manifest Dread, put a card you put into the graveyard this way into your hand. So, rather than getting a 2/2 and milling the other card, you're getting a 2/2 and putting the other card into your hand. That's a very powerful effect in decks with a lot of Manifest Dread. And if you're being attacked by a 3/1 that also has an effect, this one happens to have a survival effect. These are just examples from Duskmourn. You might say that Paranormal Analyst is going to give you a ton of card advantage going forward. And you might not think that the survival trigger of them putting a card from their graveyard into their library is that important, so you might say you just want to take the damage. And what you have to figure out is, am I going to be taking, you have to ask yourself what's going to change, right? Am I, going to get enough card advantage from this analyst in the next turn that I'm going to trade it, next time they make the same attack? Or do I have another creature coming down that's going to, be able to trade with the Cynical Loner such that I don't have to trade this valuable one? What you don't want to do is get in the scenario where every turn you're taking 3 damage because you want to keep the analyst around, only to have it eventually need to trade anyways after you've taken a bunch of damage, but you haven't necessarily gotten the value out of the Manifest Dread thing. Because you can't wait forever to get value out of your cards. Sometimes you just need to trade them off, even if they seem stronger. There's this sense that we don't want to trade a better creature for a worse creature. And that's true, right? We obviously don't want to trade down mana value or just quality value, right? These are both 2 mana uncommons. So, if we evaluate the analyst as higher value, we might still not want to trade down in terms of value and just sort of in terms of card quality. And card quality would depend on our deck, right? If we have no Manifest Dread cards in our deck, we absolutely make this trade. And if we have a bunch of them, we're maybe more hesitant. Maybe we say, oh, we can get a lot of card advantage, so we don't want to make this trade if we're at, 20 life each. Obviously, we're at a low life total. The value of those, life changes. If we have a lot of cards in hand, we might say that, we'd rather trade off 1 for 1 and preserve the life total. Like the value of life and board and cards all changes depending on what we currently have. If we have more life or less life, we have more cards or less cards. So here's like an interesting scenario, right? We were talking about a Hill Giant versus a Grizzly Bear earlier. Let's sort of use more modern cards to look at that same scenario. If we're being attacked by a 2/2, and we have a 3/3, but not just a 3/3, a very, very powerful 3/3 that when it attacks this, Huntwood's Shrieker, when it attacks Manifest Dread, it can also turn a Manifest card face up if it's a creature for just 2 mana. It's a very, very strong card, obviously. And they're attacking with just a sort of dirtily Balemerc Leech that's a 2/2. I think 99% of the time, we're not going to want to block here, right? And they know that, which means they can attack here and get 2 points of damage through. And a lot of times they might just be bluffing, but they know that we don't want to block because the Shrieker is very good. And also, if we're talking specifics, when this attacks, it's actually going to make it a 2/2 blocker that can block the Leech next turn, or in subsequent turns, whenever. So, it's going to help stabilize that attacker if it gets to attack later. So we really, really are hesitant to make this block. And obviously, this is why life total matters. If we're at 2 life, we have to make this block every time, right? We just don't have an option. And, maybe we run into a combat trick. Almost certainly, because they probably want to make this attack knowing that we have to block. So, the question becomes, right, what if we're at 4 life? Balemerc Leech is a specific card that when an enchantment enters under your control or when a room is fully unlocked, each opponent loses 1 life. So being at full life doesn't mean we're definitely dead, but it means that, we're not far away from it if we let the damage through. So sometimes we're going to have to block here. Our life total is really being pressured into, us making a really bad trade for us if they have some kind of combat trick. We're going to have to block this a lot of the time. And then let's look at the alternative, right? If we are the player with the leech, and they just have a Shrieker as a blocker, obviously the leech can't block the Shrieker, and we think they're probably going to attack. So can we attack here, assuming we have cards in hand and mana untapped, but we know our cards are not relevant. Our opponent doesn't do that. A lot of times this is going to allow us to sneak in 2 damage because they're not going to want to block. If we're able to trade the leech and a combat trick, or just the combat trick in, the case of some of these better combat tricks, for this Shrieker, we come out so far ahead. One thing, not every card in a deck is of equal value, right? So if we're trading with, their rares, that's, in terms of a deck-wise sense, we're really trading up quite a bit, because the power of your deck on average is not going to be all your rares. So even though we're trading 1 card for 1, I think we'd be very happy with that if we're able to trade 1 for 1 with, one of the best cards in the deck. So we're going to make this attack, I think, a lot of the time. Because getting those, especially because the Shrieker is going to produce value that's going to make it both harder to attack in the future and harder to win a value game. So life totals are going to matter a lot more. So this is an attack that we want to sneak in. And I think this is a lot of the margins we're talking about. I think a lot of people would make this attack. I think almost everyone would make this attack because they sort of recognize all these factors. But, there's going to be things that are, if your leech was a better creature and their Shrieker was a worse creature, if the life totals are a little different, what is the margin in which you make these attacks? And that's going to decide a lot of games. I've noticed in Duskmourn specifically, when I was doing pretty poorly at the beginning, I was losing a lot of games with my opponents on very little life. And then when I started to do a little better, I was winning a lot of games at 1 life. And there's a lot of just those really minor things, or seemingly minor things, where you're affecting life totals earlier in the game that over the course of the game end up mattering quite a bit. So, and again, if they're instead at 6 life, can they block? This is one where it's both more valuable for us to attack because getting them from 6 to 4 is a lot better, and also it's less likely to succeed, right? So this is the kind of game you're playing back and forth when you sort of think about life totals, is you're going to be taking a more important resource from them, which is 2 life out of their 6 life, and therefore they're going to be doing more to protect it, and they're going to be willing to trade more cards away to protect that. So when they're probably never going to block when they're at 20 life, they are at least sometimes going to block when they are at 6 life. And we have to factor that in when we're making our attack. It's still probably often right to attack if we think we can bluff them off of it, but we have to be aware that this is going to affect their decision making in the same way it affects our decision making. And just one final thing I want to note is you can't bluff your opponent in a situation when they have no choice. So if we attack when they're at 2 life, they're going to block 100% of the time because they have to. And that's fine if we have a combat trick, but if we do not have a combat trick, we don't want to make this bluff attack, right? You can't, your opponent has to be able to call your bluff, or not call your bluff, I guess, believe your bluff, and still survive for it to be a bluff worth making. If they're forced to call the bluff, then you have to assume they're going to call the bluff. If for some reason your opponent doesn't block when they're on 2 life, I guess you just win. But we don't need to worry about beating those opponents, I guess. What you need to be aware of is you can't try to trick your opponent in a situation where they don't have any optionality. They're not going to make the wrong play when they only have 1 play to make. This is another scenario. It's similar to one of the earlier ones. But Twitching Doll is, you can add a nest counter to it when you add mana when you tap it for mana, it adds nest counters. Eventually you can sacrifice for a number of spiders, right? So this is an obvious situation where by blocking, we trade 1 for 1. Eventually we can make 2 or more spiders and then trade with the Wildfire Worker Folk, which is a 3/2 for 2 with haste. Delirium gives it +1/+1 in trample. Very good card. So, we basically have to ask ourselves, how many times can we trade 3 life to get another spider? And how valuable those spiders are going to be, and how vulnerable is our twitching doll going to be? You never want to make this block. I think it's in the sense that it's always going to feel bad if your opponent attacks with their 3/2 and you have to block with this twitching doll, which is a very strong card that can make, has the upside of making a ton of spiders if you can keep it on the board and produce a mana. It does a ton of stuff. But sometimes you're going to need to make this. At 20 life, maybe you don't need to. But if you don't have a plan to address this Wicker Folk going forward, if you're going to tap the Twitching Doll and play a 4-mana creature that is going to, hold back this Wildfire Wicker Folk, that obviously seems like the direction you want to take. But if you have no answers for this Wicker Folk, you don't want to just be taking 3 damage indefinitely. So maybe you'll do it after you have 2 counters on the Twitching Doll, and then you've up a 2/2, but you've traded 6 life for that. You sort of have to evaluate how many life is worth those 2/2s, and sort of understand those are the trades you're making. So that's basically all I wanted to touch on. Life total is a resource that isn't sort of like completely a myth, but it's something that I think is just so misapplied, right? It's a resource to be used, not wasted. You can't be so cavalier about your life total that you're valuing it at basically 0. You can't be afraid of looking silly to a combat trick and always taking damage for free either, right? You need to value your life total in the same way you value cards. Not to the same extent. One card is not usually worth 1, life, but there is some number, and there is some situation where that's just the case. There's, situations where you trade any number of cards for 1 life because that's the only access the game is being decided on right then. And trading life for cards and tempo can be good or bad, depending on matchups and game state. I think there's some players that are just so willing to trade any amount of life total for cards that they will just, trade the whole game away and end the game with a handful of cards. And that isn't helpful. Because it doesn't matter what the board looks like when you're reduced to 0 life, or when you reduce your opponent to 0 life. Whoever's has life total left wins in that scenario. So sometimes it's about reaching a specific spot, even if you couldn't make it 1 inch further, in terms of life total. If you can deal exactly 20, it doesn't actually matter that you've traded everything and you could never deal another point of damage. And that's one of the reasons that life total is so important to preserve, is because you don't want to give your opponents those windows in order to make plays that attack you on the life total axis that you haven't been working on, that you haven't been prepared for because you've been trading it for other things. And it's worth valuing life total early so that you can use it later. Again, that doesn't mean chump blocking, 3/3s with your 2/2, but it means that sometimes you're going to have to trade your more, your 2/2 with an ability for the 2/2 without an ability. And because every time you're attacked, right, the scenario, you can either block or not block, but the scenario where you don't block is one in which you take damage, right? That's bad for you. The fact that your opponent attacked, they paid a cost for that by tapping their creatures. They gave you the opportunity to block, and blocking is very powerful because you get to choose who blocks what in Magic. But if you don't block, you do take damage. So that scenario is sort of, by default, very bad for us. So we want to be blocking quite a bit when we're attacked. And yeah, I know this sounds very obvious, but I think if we all look at our gameplay, we can see situations where we're just a little bit too willing to take damage, a little bit hesitant to try to force in damage, and we're not correctly evaluating what access the game's going to matter on, right? You talk about sort of control decks, right, that have a lot of counter spells, have a lot of, sweepers. There's a lot of, sort of constructed decks where if you're on 1 life and you have a handful of 7 counter spells or something, you can consider yourself very safe. In Limited, it's often not that case, right? We often don't have counter spells. There's usually something our opponent can do if we're on a low life total that might win them the game. So being willing to go super low is sometimes exactly what you need to do, but you need to figure out whether low is 1 or whether low is 6 or whether it's some other number. just depending on the amount of reach in the format, depending on the different ways your opponent can get through damage, depending on how stable your control of the board is. So I hope this type of video is helpful. I know it's a little bit different, a little bit less focused than some other ones. I appreciate you all watching. I hope everyone's doing well. Thank you.